On a rainy night, a young candy seller accidentally overhears a plan to take over a tech giant. Ignored by the company's founder, he reveals a secret recording that confirms the conspiracy. That quiet act triggers a twist that changes the fate of everyone involved. The rain lashed down on the streets of Manhattan's financial district that January Monday. The New York winter showed its most unforgiving face, with icy winds that cut through the skin and a fine drizzle that soaked you to the bone. Even so, Luke Oliver, a slim 15-year-old with watchful eyes, stood firm at the entrance of the imposing crystal tower, protecting his small box of fudge brownie bites with a makeshift plastic cover. "Gourmet brownie bites, 2 for 10, 3 for 15, he announced in a steady voice, trying to catch the attention of the executives who hurried in and out of the building, many without even noticing him. Luke was not like other boys his age. While most were studying and worrying about video games and social media, he had been navigating the streets of New York since he was 12, when his mother fell ill and the bills began to pile up. His father, a truck driver, had left for a cross-country trip and never returned. The small apartment on the far side of the Bronx was left behind when the rent fell too far in arrears. Now, he and Mrs. Irina Petrova, a 72-year-old Russian woman, who had taken him in like a grandson, shared a modest room in a shelter for vulnerable people on the Lower East Side. Mrs. Irina had arrived in the United States 15 years ago, fleeing political troubles in her home country. She was a retired teacher with heavily accented English, but with a generous heart that quickly grew fond of the sharp-eyed boy. "Always remember, Lukachka," she would say, using the Russian diminutive for his name. "Ears that listen see better than distracted eyes." It was she who taught Luke some basic Russian during the nights at the shelter, when they couldn't sleep because of the noise or the cold. The boy had a knack for languages and quickly memorized phrases and expressions which delighted the old woman. "You have a good head, boy. Very good." On that specific night, as the rain intensified and the last executives left the building, Luke was preparing to pack up his box of sweets when he noticed 3 men taking shelter under the side awning of the building. Unlike the others, they weren't wearing impeccable suits, but casual, elegant clothes. They spoke in low voices and, to his surprise, in Russian. Instinctively, Luke stepped back into the shadows, adjusting his position so he could hear better. His heart raced as he began to understand fragments of their conversation. "The contract is already with the legal department," said the tallest of the 3, a bald man with a well-trimmed beard. "No one will notice the clauses in Section 17. They're hidden among technical terms." "Are you sure Vance won't spot it?" asked the second man, younger and more nervous, drumming his fingers on the briefcase he was carrying. "That cripple is more concerned with his health than with contractual details," replied the third, a burly man with graying hair. "In 6 months, Vance Tech will be ours. The board will approve our proposal tomorrow, and by the time they realize what's happened, it will be too late." Luke swallowed hard. Even with his limited knowledge of Russian, he understood that these men were plotting something against someone named Vance. He instantly recalled the recent headlines about Edward Vance, the founder of Vance Tech, one of the largest tech companies in the United States. The entrepreneur had been featured in Forbes magazine and was known for his genius in developing artificial intelligence software. "We need to make sure he signs it personally," the bald man continued. "If it goes through the internal legal department, they might identify the loopholes." "Don't worry," replied the oldest one. "I've already bribed 2 external lawyers. They're on our side and will push for an immediate signature, claiming urgency." Luke felt his legs tremble. What he had just heard was clearly a plan to deceive the businessman and take over his company. Carefully, he took his old cell phone out of his pocket, a gift from Mrs. Irina, who had insisted he needed to be connected, and with trembling hands activated the voice recorder. It was crazy, he thought. Who would believe a street kid? The men continued talking for another 10 minutes, discussing details of contractual clauses and how they would expedite the process to seize control of the company. When they finally said their goodbyes and headed for the parking garage, Luke was drenched, shivering from the cold, and his heart was pounding. He returned to the shelter that night with less money than usual, but with something potentially more valuable: the recording. When he arrived, he found Mrs. Irina worried about his delay. "Lukachka, I thought something bad had happened. You're soaked." "Mrs. Irina," he said, his eyes wide, "I need your help. I heard men speaking in Russian. They're planning to steal a company." The old woman watched him intently as he recounted what he had heard. After listening to the recording, her expression hardened. "This is very serious, boy. These men are talking about hidden clauses in a contract. They want to take the company from someone named Vance." "It's Edward Vance, from Vance Tech, that famous entrepreneur who's in the newspapers," Luke explained, showing a picture of the man on his phone. Tall, elegantly built, always leaning on a custom cane. "We must warn this man," Mrs. Irina declared firmly. "What they are planning is a betrayal. In my country, we call this zmenyi ukus, the serpent's bite, when it comes from someone you trust." "But how? Who's going to believe us?" Luke questioned, running a hand through his wet hair. "Tomorrow you will go there," the old woman replied with determination. "I will translate the entire conversation and write it down on a piece of paper. You take the recording and try to speak with this man." That night Luke barely slept. While other boys his age dreamed of football games or video games, he was about to enter the most imposing skyscraper in the financial district to try to save a tech empire. The irony was not lost on him. He, who had never owned a computer, now held the fate of one of the country's largest tech companies in his hands. In the early morning, while Mrs. Irina slept, Luke listened to the recording over and over, trying to memorize every Russian word and its meaning. He knew his chances of being heard were minimal, but something inside him pushed him to try. Perhaps it was the desire to make a difference, or simply the hope that if he helped Edward Vance, his own life might change. What he didn't imagine was how much his decision would transform not only his future, but the destinies of many other people. If this story has intrigued you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Continuing. In the penthouse of the Vance Tech headquarters, Edward Vance watched New York City through the immense glass windows. At 47, the entrepreneur had built a tech empire that had started in a garage in Soho and now occupied 3 floors of one of the most imposing buildings in the financial district. The panoramic view of the city was breathtaking, especially on that morning when the sky, after the previous night's storm, displayed an almost unreal blue. Vance adjusted his weight on the elegant silver cane, an object that over the past 2 years had become not just a support, but a part of his identity. Diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at 45, at the height of his company's success, he had turned his physical limitation into a symbol of resilience. The cane, personalized with a small blue crystal, on top, the company's color, was now his trademark, as much as his penetrating gaze and the always perfectly trimmed beard. "Edward, the board meeting is set for 2 p.m. Everyone has confirmed," announced Caroline Martin, Director of Operations and his most trusted confidant, as she entered the room. Tall, with dark skin and short, curly hair, Caroline was known for her unwavering competence and loyalty. "Including our Russian friends?" Edward asked, turning with a calculated movement, adapting to the growing stiffness in his left leg. "Yes, the complete trio. Victor Branson, Henry Meyer, and Andrew Burke have confirmed. They seem eager. About signing the new expansion agreement." Edward nodded thoughtfully. Those 3 board members had grown closer in recent months, always aligned in strategic votes, always suggesting changes that subtly diminished his decision-making power. It wasn't paranoia. As a businessman, Edward had developed a 6th sense for detecting threats, and something about that group didn't feel trustworthy. "There's something about their behavior that bothers me, Caroline," he confessed, using the nickname only a few were allowed. "It's as if they're playing chess while the rest of us are playing checkers." "Coincidentally, I received the expansion contract this morning. They're pushing for a quick signature, citing deadlines with foreign investors," Caroline commented, handing him a folder. "Do you want the legal department to review it more carefully?" "There's no time," Edward replied, leafing through the lengthy document. "They'll argue that any delay could compromise the investments. You know how nervous the board gets when we mention loss of capital." The dialogue was interrupted by a hesitant knock on the door. Both turned, surprised by the interruption. That floor was restricted and meetings were always scheduled in advance. "Come in," Edward ordered. The door opened slowly, revealing Marina, his secretary, looking visibly embarrassed. "Mr. Vance, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a boy in the reception insisting on speaking with you. He says it's urgent, something about a plot against the company." Edward and Caroline exchanged intrigued glances. "A boy? What kind of boy?" the entrepreneur inquired. "A teenager, sir. Apparently he sells sweets around the building. We normally wouldn't allow it, but he's very agitated. Mentioned something about a recording in Russian and conspirators. Security was about to remove him when I decided to consult you, considering the specificity of the claim." Edward frowned. New York was full of scammers and opportunists, and his position attracted all sorts of unusual approaches. Still, the mention of the Russian language intrigued him. Few knew that 3 of his board members were descendants of Russian immigrants and occasionally communicated in that language during informal conversations. "It's probably a prank or someone looking for money," Caroline commented. Edward considered the situation for a few seconds, leaning more firmly on his cane. "Send him up," he finally decided. "If it's a scam, I want to see the kid's creativity. If it's not—" He left the sentence hanging with a slight shrug. Minutes later, a visibly nervous Luke was led into the room. The contrast couldn't be greater. The slim teenager, in simple clothes and with a small box of brownie bites, standing in the center of the luxurious office with marble floors and contemporary art on the walls. "So, young man, I hear you have urgent information about my company," Edward began, sitting in his ergonomic chair, his cane carefully placed beside him. Luke swallowed hard, intimidated by the grandeur of the place and the presence of the entrepreneur he only knew from newspaper photos. In person, Edward Vance radiated authority, even while seated. "Mr. Vance, I sell brownie bites nearby, and last night when it was raining hard, I heard 3 men talking in Russian on the side of the building," he began, his voice trembling. "They were talking about a contract with hidden clauses to take control of your company in 6 months. Edward raised an eyebrow, maintaining a neutral expression while Caroline, standing beside him, crossed her arms in a sign of skepticism. "And how would you understand a conversation in Russian, son?" the entrepreneur questioned. "I learned from Mrs. Irina, a Russian lady who lives with me at the shelter on the Lower East Side. She's been teaching me for almost 3 years, Luke explained, gaining more confidence as he spoke of the elderly woman. "I didn't understand everything, but I understood enough to know they want to trick you, and I recorded the conversation." With slightly trembling hands, Luke took an old cell phone from his pocket, opened the recording app, and held out the device. "It's all here. They mentioned clauses in Section 17, and called you, he hesitated. "A cripple?" Edward completed with a bitter smile. "Wouldn't be the first time. Continue." "Yes, that," Luke confirmed, embarrassed. "They said you're too worried about your health to notice the contract details, and they talked about bribing external lawyers to push for a quick signature." Caroline and Edward exchanged significant looks. The boy had mentioned details too specific to be just an improvised scam. The director took the phone and made a silent gesture, asking for permission to listen to the recording. "Son, I'll be direct," Edward declared, fixing his eyes on Luke's. "Do you have any idea what you're alleging? You're accusing board members of a multi-billion-dollar technology company of conspiracy and fraud." "I know it sounds crazy," Luke replied, holding his gaze. "And I know nobody would believe a kid who sells brownie bites. But my grandmother, Mrs. Irina, always taught me that the truth is more important than the messenger." Something in the boy's sincerity touched Edward. In his years of experience with people, he had developed an almost instinctive ability to identify liars. This boy might be mistaken or confused, but he didn't seem to be lying. Caroline, who was listening intently to the recording, suddenly turned pale. As the granddaughter of Ukrainian immigrants, she understood enough of the language to recognize keywords. "Edward," she interrupted, her voice urgent, "you need to hear this. He's telling the truth. I can make out mentions of hidden clauses, 6-month timelines, and—" She lowered her voice. "Victor Branson's name is clearly mentioned as the leader of the plan." Edward's expression hardened. Victor Branson was the oldest member of the board, someone he had considered almost a mentor in the company's early years. The sense of betrayal was immediate and intense. "Let me hear it," he requested, holding out his hand for the phone. As the recording played, the entrepreneur's face gradually transformed. The skeptical expression gave way to shock, then to controlled anger, and finally to a cold, calculated resolve that Luke found more frightening than any display of rage. "Caroline, cancel my attendance at the board meeting. Say I had a relapse and needed to go to the doctor urgently. In the meantime, summon our trusted lawyers and request a thorough analysis of this contract, especially Section 17. I want a full report in 2 hours." The director nodded and quickly left the room, leaving Edward alone with the teenager, who remained standing, uncomfortable. "Please sit down," the entrepreneur indicated, pointing to the chair in front of him. "What's your name?" "Luke Oliver, sir." "Well, Luke Oliver, it seems you've just saved my company from a billion-dollar scam," Edward declared with a restrained smile. "And that deserves more than a simple thank you." Luke blinked, confused. He hadn't expected to be believed so quickly, let alone valued in that way. "I just did what I thought was right, sir." "Most people wouldn't even do that," Edward replied, observing him with renewed interest. "Now, tell me more about this Mrs. Irina, and how you learned Russians selling brownie bites on the streets of New York." And so, as the storm brewed behind the scenes at Vanstech, Luke began to tell his story to the man who, unbeknownst to him yet, would completely transform his destiny. The afternoon at Vanstech turned into a whirlwind of activity. While Luke remained in Edward's office, watching in fascination as lawyers and executives moved in and out with documents and tense expressions, Caroline coordinated a full-blown investigation behind the scenes. "I need to call Mrs. Irina," Luke remembered suddenly. "She must be worried. I just said I was coming to try and talk to you, but it's already past lunchtime." Edward, who was analyzing documents on his tablet, looked up. "Use my phone," he offered, pointing to the device on his desk, "and invite her to come here. I would like to personally thank the person who taught Russian to my unlikely savior." Luke dialed the shelter's number, embarrassed by the unexpected generosity. After briefly explaining the situation to Mrs. Irina and reassuring her that he wasn't in trouble, he passed on the entrepreneur's invitation. "She said she's coming," he reported, hanging up the phone with almost reverential care. "But it will take a while. The bus from the Lower East Side to here takes almost an hour at this time." "I'll send a car for her," Edward decided promptly, sending a message to his secretary with the address Luke provided. While they waited, the entrepreneur insisted that the young man tell him more about his life. With an initial hesitation that soon turned into a fluid narrative, Luke recounted his journey, his mother's illness, his father's abandonment, the financial hardships, and how he met Mrs. Irina at the shelter. "She had no one. I had no one. We ended up becoming family," he explained simply. "She was the one who encouraged me to sell brownie bites, instead of begging for money. She said honest work builds character, and that education and languages open doors." Edward listened intently, impressed by the teenager's maturity. Before he could comment, Caroline burst into the room, holding a folder and looking grave. "We found it," she announced, placing the documents on the table. "Section 17, subsection C, paragraphs 5 through 9. It's all there, camouflaged in technical jargon about intellectual property transfer. Basically, the contract gradually transfers operational control of the company to a special executive committee over 6 months. And guess who makes up that committee? Our Russian friends," Edward concluded, a flash of anger in his eyes that quickly gave way to a calculated calm. "And the external lawyers?" "Confirmed as well. 2 of them received substantial payments from an offshore account controlled by Victor. We're tracing the money trail now." Edward pressed his temples, processing the betrayal. Victor Branson had been his mentor, the first to believe in his project when Vanstech was just an ambitious idea. The pain of disloyalty was almost physical. "What are we going to do about the board meeting?" Caroline asked. "We're keeping it," Edward replied after a moment of reflection. With a slight change to the agenda, prepare a presentation with everything we've discovered. I want all board members present, not just our conspirators. You're going to confront them publicly? The director asked, surprised. In the most New Yorker way possible, with elegance and irrefutable proof, Edward confirmed, a cold smile forming on his lips. They underestimated me because of this, he added, tapping his cane lightly. We're going to show them that my mind works perfectly. The door opened again and Marina announced Mrs. Irina's arrival. The white-haired woman entered, leaning on her own cane, much simpler than Edward's, but equally dignified in its posture. She wore modest but impeccably clean clothes, and her shrewd gaze quickly scanned the room before settling on the entrepreneur. Mr. Vance, she greeted in her heavily accented English. Thank you for transport. Very comfortable. Edward stood up, leaning on his cane, and extended his free hand. Mrs. Irina, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your pupil saved my company today. The elderly woman smiled with maternal pride at Luke before turning back to the businessman. Lukachka has a good heart and attentive ears. In Russia, we say, he who knows how to listen learns twice. We'll need your help to fully translate the recording, Edward explained. We have crucial parts, but we want to understand every detail before the board meeting. The next few hours were spent in intense preparation. Mrs. Irina, sitting comfortably on a sofa in Edward's office, meticulously translated each segment of the recorded conversation while Caroline took notes. Luke watched, alternating between pride in his mentor's skill and awe at the magnitude of the conspiracy he had uncovered. At 3:30 p.m., with the board meeting rescheduled for 4 p.m., Edward took a break from the preparations and approached Luke, who was admiring the city view from the panoramic window. Ever imagined New York from this high up before? The entrepreneur asked, positioning himself beside the young man. Never, Luke admitted. From where I live, I only see the skyscrapers from a distance. They look like another world. I came from humble beginnings too, Edward revealed. My father was a mechanic in Bushwick, Brooklyn, my mother a seamstress. I grew up in a cramped row house, sharing a room with 2 brothers. I only got here because someone believed in me when I was a little older than you. Luke turned, surprised. You weren't born rich. Far from it, Edward smiled. I got a scholarship to study programming when I was 17, thanks to a teacher who saw potential in me. That was my first step up. I always promised myself that if I became successful, I would pay it forward. The implication hung in the air between them, but before they could continue the conversation, Caroline informed them it was time for the meeting. The board was assembled, waiting in the conference room. Come with me, Edward invited, surprising both Luke and Mrs. Irina. You are a fundamental part of this story now. The Vance Tech conference room occupied half the floor and was impressive for its combination of technology and elegance. A massive oval table seated 12 people, all in formal attire and with puzzled expressions as they saw Edward enter, accompanied by a teenager and an elderly woman. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, I apologize for the delay and for the unexpected guests, Edward began, taking his place at the head of the table, but they are essential to the matter we will be discussing today. At the opposite end, Victor Branson, a man in his 60s with grey hair and an aristocratic bearing, frowned. Edward, we have a set agenda and an important contract to approve, he protested in a controlled voice. Personal matters should be handled at another time. Oh, but this is an eminently professional matter, Victor, Edward replied, maintaining a cordial smile as he signaled for Caroline to start the presentation on the large screen. In fact, it concerns the very future of our company. The screen lit up with an enlarged image of the contract, highlighting Section 17. Alongside it, a translation of the recorded conversation appeared, with the participants' names clearly identified. Ladies and gentlemen, before we sign any documents today, I'd like to share an interesting discovery made by my guests here, Edward continued, gesturing towards Luke and Mrs. Irina. It seems our expansion contract contains some peculiarities that were not openly discussed. Victor's face turned visibly pale, while Henry Meyer and Andrew Burke, the other 2 conspirators, exchanged nervous glances. "What are you talking about, Edward?" questioned Teresa Gomez, one of the independent directors, leaning in to better analyze the projected document. "I'm talking about a coordinated attempt to take control of Vance Tech through hidden contractual clauses," Edward replied, his tone now sharp as a razor. "Clauses inserted by people who believed my physical condition affected my mental capacity." A shocked murmur spread through the room as Caroline moved on to show the evidence. Bank transfers, compromising emails, and finally, the complete transcript of the recorded conversation. "This is absurd! A fabrication!" Victor protested, rising abruptly. "You can't believe the words of a street punk and an old immigrant over respected members of this board." The ensuing silence was broken by Mrs. Irina's calm voice. "In my country," she pronounced clearly, staring at Victor, "men who betray are called predatelli, traitors. It doesn't matter how expensive their suits are." The statement, unexpected and direct, created a moment of absolute tension before Edward resumed speaking. "Members of the board, I have here opinions from 3 independent law firms confirming that the hidden clauses in this contract constitute corporate fraud. I also have proof of irregular payments to external lawyers to accelerate the approval of this document without due diligence." Edward rose, leaning on his cane, his figure exuding an unshakable authority. "I therefore propose the immediate removal of board members Victor Branson, Henry Meyer, and Andrew Burke for violation of the Code of Ethics and attempted fraud against this company. I request a roll call vote now." What followed was a flawless demonstration of leadership. With indisputable evidence and the support of the other board members, shocked by the betrayal, Edward secured a unanimous vote for the conspirators' removal. As Victor, the last to leave, shot a look of pure hatred towards Luke, Edward subtly positioned himself between them, a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by the young man. After the tumultuous exit of the former board members, escorted by security, Edward returned to the room where Luke and Mrs. Irina were waiting, accompanied by Caroline and a few remaining directors. "You saved not only my company, but the livelihood of over 2,000 employees," the entrepreneur declared. "Vance Tech owes you a great deal, and I personally do as well." Turning specifically to Luke, he continued, "You've shown more integrity and courage than many adults I know, and you've reminded me of the importance of paying opportunities forward." The young brownie bite seller looked at the powerful businessman, feeling that this moment would forever change the course of his life, without yet imagining how right that intuition was. The apartment on the Upper West Side was modest but cozy, with windows that allowed a generous amount of morning light to stream in. Luke Oliver, now 20, adjusted his navy blue tie in front of the mirror while trying to control his nerves. His reflection showed a tall young man with broad shoulders and a confident gaze, a far cry from the scrawny teenager who sold brownie bites 5 years ago. "You look very elegant, Lukachka," praised Mrs. Irina, entering the room with slow but still steady steps for her 77 years. "Like a real executive," Luke smiled at the elderly woman. The years had been kind. To Mrs. Irina since they moved into this apartment, a gift from Edward Vance. Her health had improved considerably with access to proper treatment, and the comfort of a safe home had brought the sparkle back to her clear eyes. "It's just an internship presentation, Grandma," he replied, using the affectionate term he had adopted for the woman who had raised him like a grandson. "But thank you. Is the suit too much?" "It's never too much to show respect for your work," she stated with conviction, adjusting his tie knot with experienced hands. "Remember what I always say. Appearance opens doors, but character decides if you stay," Luke completed, repeating one of the many sayings the old woman had taught him over the years. After the episode that saved Vance Tech, Luke's life had transformed completely. Edward Vance, true to his promise of paying opportunities forward, had offered him and Mrs. Irina an apartment and ensured the young man resumed his studies at one of New York's best private schools. Initially resistant to the idea of leaving the streets, Luke was eventually convinced by Mrs. Irina's insistence and the prospect of a better future. Adapting hadn't been easy. Despite being intelligent, Luke had to overcome years of fragmented education, facing the veiled prejudice of upper-middle-class classmates and teachers who doubted his ability. It took nights of intense study, with Mrs. Irina brewing strong tea and encouraging him not to give up. "The best revenge is success," she would repeat, when tears of frustration threatened to overcome him. The dedication paid off. Luke not only graduated from high school with honors, but also earned a full scholarship for business administration at NYU, one of the most prestigious universities in the country. Now, in his third year of college, he was starting his internship at Vance Tech itself, in the corporate social responsibility department. "Edward called last night while you were at the library," Mrs. Irina commented, helping him gather his documents for the presentation. "He said he won't be at today's meeting, but Caroline will be representing him." Luke nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. In the first few years after the incident, Edward had kept in frequent contact, inviting them for occasional dinners and closely monitoring the young man's academic progress. Recently, however, their meetings had become rarer. According to Caroline, the entrepreneur's health condition required increasingly intensive care, limiting his public appearances. "That's fine. It's better this way. I don't want special treatment," Luke replied, though he missed Edward's guiding presence. After a quick breakfast, Luke said goodbye to Mrs. Irina and headed for the subway station. The commute to the financial district was long, but he preferred public transport, a choice that surprised his university classmates, many of whom drove imported cars to campus. 40 minutes later, Luke crossed the Vance Tech lobby with a mix of nostalgia and anxiety. The building was still imposing, but now, instead of observing it as a stranger from the sidewalk, he had a badge. That granted him access. The contrast was not lost on him. On the 30th floor, Caroline Martin was waiting for him. At 43, she now held the position of Chief Operating Officer of the company, managing daily business, while Edward, still chairman of the board, focused on long-term strategic direction. "Punctual as always," she observed with a smile, leading him to the meeting room. "Nervous?" "A little," Luke admitted. "It's the first time I'm presenting something formal to the investment committee." "You'll do great," Caroline assured him. "I read your preliminary report. It's solid, innovative, and aligned with our values. You just need to defend your conclusions with the same conviction you had when you first walked into this building 5 years ago." The meeting began promptly at 9 o'clock, with 6 senior executives in addition to Caroline. Luke presented his analysis of Vance Tech's social programs, highlighting areas for improvement and suggesting new initiatives. His proposals were bold, including partnerships with community-based NGOs and investments in technology training for low-income youth, but were grounded in meticulous research and cost-benefit analyses. "Impressive, Mr. Oliver," commented Paul Mendez, the chief financial officer, after the presentation, "but some of these initiatives would represent significant costs, with no immediate measurable return. How do you justify these investments in an unstable economic climate?" Luke took a deep breath before answering. It was the question he had expected and feared. "Director Mendez, I see these investments not as costs, but as seeds. Vance Tech grew by selling software, but it thrives because of people. By investing in underserved communities, we're not just fulfilling a social responsibility, we're cultivating talent that would otherwise remain invisible." He paused deliberately, recalling the communication skills he had learned in college. "Furthermore, our research indicates that consumers, especially Gen Z, prioritize brands with an authentic purpose. Every dollar invested in social impact generates approximately $3 in brand value and customer loyalty. It's a business case as much as it is an ethical imperative." The room was silent for a few seconds until Caroline intervened. "Thank you, Luke. The committee will review your proposals and will get back to you with a decision next week." Leaving the meeting, Luke felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. He headed to his small workstation, where he planned to review some reports before lunch. He was interrupted by the arrival of Marcella Price, a junior analyst who occupied the adjacent desk. "How did it go?" she asked curiously. "Did you convince them?" "Hard to say," Luke replied with a sigh. "They listened, at least. The rest depends on how much they're willing to change." Well, while you were up there impressing the big shots, I found something interesting in the external audit reports, Marcella commented, lowering her voice and leaning in. I thought it might interest you, considering your project. Intrigued, Luke examined the documents she displayed on her tablet. They were reports on environmental and labor compliance from VanceTech's suppliers in Asia and Latin America. The more he read, the more his brow furrowed. This can't be right, he murmured, analyzing data on poor working conditions, environmental violations in outsourced factories, and complex tax schemes that bordered on illegality. The company has strict policies against this kind of practice. Policies on paper, Marcella replied gravely. In practice, our procurement department prioritizes costs. And guess who oversees the global supply chain? Who? Luke asked, though he suspected the answer. Rafael Torres, Edward Vance's protege and one of the most influential people in the company. Nobody questions his methods because he delivers results. Luke leaned back in his chair, absorbing the impact of this information. The VanceTech he had saved 5 years ago, and which had in turn saved him, now appeared very different from the image he had built in his mind. The company that publicly championed ethical innovation had shadows that contradicted its stated values. Over the next few days, Luke conducted his own discreet investigation, cross-referencing data and consulting reports. The deeper he dug, the more worrying the situation became. It wasn't just specific suppliers, but a systematic pattern of outsourcing to companies with questionable practices, combined with aggressive tax avoidance strategies that, while technically legal, contradicted the discourse of corporate responsibility. The discovery placed him in a profound dilemma. Confronting these issues would mean challenging not only the company's power structure, but Edward himself, the man who had transformed his life and in whom he placed enormous admiration and gratitude. After a week of anguish, Luke shared his findings with Mrs. Arena over dinner. "What should I do, Grandma?" he asked, listlessly stirring his food. "If I speak up, I could lose everything we've gained. If I stay silent, I betray my principles." The elderly woman watched him for a long time, her piercing blue eyes assessing the conflict on her foster grandson's face. "Remember what I taught you about listening?" she finally asked. Luke nodded. "That attentive ears see better than distracted eyes." "Exactly," she confirmed. "Now you have heard the truth. To ignore it would be like willingly becoming blind." "But I owe loyalty to Edward," Luke argued. "He gave us all of this." "No," Mrs. Arena corrected firmly. "He recognized your worth and repaid a good deed. That is not a purchase of silence. It is an opportunity. True loyalty is not always agreeing, but helping someone to be their best self." In the early hours of the next morning, Luke sent an email requesting a private meeting with Edward Vance. The reply came surprisingly quickly. The meeting would be that very afternoon. With a heavy but determined heart, Luke organized his findings into an objective presentation. The decision was made. He would confront his mentor with the truth, even if it cost him his future at VanceTech. Edward Vance's mansion, perched atop the Upper East Side, was an imposing structure that blended contemporary lines with elements of colonial American architecture. Luke, who had never been there before, observed the meticulously manicured garden while he waited in the living room. The driver sent by Edward had dropped him at the main entrance 10 minutes earlier, and since then a housekeeper had led him inside, offering him water or coffee, both of which his nervous stomach declined. The room, spacious and bright with large windows opening to a privileged view of New York City, was decorated with contemporary American art and designer furniture. Above the fireplace, Luke noticed a photograph that surprised him. Himself, alongside Edward and Mrs. Arena, at his high school graduation 3 years ago. He hadn't imagined the entrepreneur would keep that memory so prominently displayed. "That was a memorable day," a voice said from behind him. Luke turned to find Edward Vance seated in a motorized wheelchair at the entrance to the room. The progression of his multiple sclerosis was evident. The entrepreneur, now 52, appeared physically more frail, his body thinner and his movements visibly limited. However, his eyes retained the same penetrating intensity, and his posture, even seated, radiated authority. "Edward," Luke greeted, stepping forward for a handshake. "Thank you for having me at your home." "The cane is no longer enough," Edward explained, noticing Luke's glance at the wheelchair. "Necessary adaptations. But the mind remains as sharp as ever, don't you worry." He guided the chair to a more intimate seating area, indicating for Luke to sit on the sofa opposite him. "Caroline told me about your presentation. Impressive ideas. I knew you would make good use of the opportunities." Luke swallowed hard. The mention of the opportunities Edward had given him made what he was about to do even more difficult. "Thank you," he replied, opening his laptop. "But that's not what I came to talk about." The entrepreneur raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the serious tone. "Straight to the point, then. What have you discovered, Luke?" The question caught the young man by surprise. "How do you know I've discovered something?" Edward smiled, a gesture that mixed irony with genuine amusement. "I know that look. It's the same one you had 5 years ago when you walked into my office to warn me about a conspiracy. It's the look of someone carrying a heavy weight." With a sigh, Luke began his presentation. Methodically, he exposed the labor violations in outsourced factories in Malaysia and Mexico, the documented but ignored environmental infractions, the tax avoidance schemes that diverted resources that should have benefited American communities, and the chain of decisions that linked these practices to high-level Vanstech executives, including Rafael Torres. For 20 minutes, he spoke without interruption, presenting evidence, charts, and testimonies compiled in his investigation. Edward listened in silence, his face impassive, occasionally taking notes on a tablet. "I know Rafael is important to the company," Luke concluded, "and I understand that global business requires complex compromises. But these practices directly contradict the values Vanstech publicly champions, the same values that inspired me." Edward watched him for long seconds after the presentation ended, his gaze unreadable. "Do you know why I chose Rafael to oversee our global supply chain?" he finally asked. "I imagine for his efficiency," Luke replied. "For his obedience," Edward corrected. "Rafael never questions orders. He executes them perfectly, regardless of the ethical implications. It's a valuable quality in the corporate world." He paused, maneuvering the chair to get closer to the window. "When I built Vanstech, the world was different. Global competition was less fierce, consumers less aware, investors less demanding of quarterly results. The rules have changed, Luke. To survive, we adapted." Luke felt a tightness in his chest. It wasn't just disappointment. It was a profound sense of betrayal, not just of corporate values, but of everything he thought he had learned from Edward. "So the stories about your unwavering integrity are just marketing?" he questioned, unable to contain the accusatory tone. Edward turned the chair, facing him directly. "Don't simplify decades of business decisions with moralistic judgments, Luke. The world isn't black and white. I built a company that employs thousands of Americans, that develops domestic technology in a country that imports innovation. That has value." "At the cost of exploiting Asian workers," Luke retorted, "of environmental degradation, of American communities losing tax revenue?" "At the cost of what's necessary," Edward replied, his tone hardening. "Do you think our American and Chinese competitors play fair? Ethical purity is a luxury that global companies cannot fully afford." Luke closed his laptop, feeling a mixture of anger and disappointment. "That's not what you taught me. When you took me in, you said opportunities should be paid forward. That integrity is worth more than profit." "And I believe that," Edward exclaimed, lightly tapping the armrest of his chair. "But there are nuances, necessary compromises." "Compromises or conveniences?" Luke insisted. 5 years ago, you faced traitors willing to do anything for profit. Today, the difference between your practices and theirs seems to be a matter of degree, not of kind." The comment hit Edward like a physical blow. His face contorted for a moment before he regained his composure. "You have no idea of the pressures I've faced, the sacrifices I've made," he replied, his voice lower now. "You have no idea what it means to carry the weight of thousands of jobs, of responsibilities that go beyond youthful idealism." Luke realized the conversation was entering dangerous territory, both professionally and emotionally. Edward was not just his mentor, but someone he deeply admired, almost a father figure. "I didn't come to accuse," he clarified, moderating his tone. "I came because I believe VanceTech can be better, that it can align its practices and values without compromising its competitiveness." "And how do you suggest we do that, young idealist?" Edward questioned, with a hint of sarcasm that barely masked his hurt. "By creating an ethical innovation division," Luke proposed, having thought carefully about the solution. "A department with the authority to audit internal practices and develop sustainable alternatives for every problematic aspect we've identified." Edward let out a short laugh, but one not entirely devoid of admiration. "And who would lead this division? You, I presume?" "Someone with vision and moral authority," Luke replied, holding his mentor's gaze. "Someone who understands both business and ethics. It could be me, yes, but I would need real autonomy and adequate resources." The entrepreneur watched him for long seconds, a complex expression on his face, part pride, part irritation, part something Luke couldn't decipher. "Do you know what I see when I look at you, Luke?" he finally asked. "I see the ghost of who I was at 20, before the compromises, the concessions, the necessary adaptations. It's unsettling and simultaneously invigorating." He moved the chair towards a side table, from which he picked up a picture frame. It was an old photo, showing a young Edward next to a grey-haired gentleman. "This was Anthony Garrison, the man who believed in me and financed my first project. He had unwavering values, strict principles. We argued fiercely when I started to adapt our practices to grow faster." He paused significantly. "I pushed him out of the company he helped create. Years later, when my condition was diagnosed, he was the first to offer support, with no hard feelings." He returned the picture frame to its place, something like regret crossing his gaze. "My illness brought clarity in many respects, Luke. When the body fails, you start to question what legacy you'll leave behind. I don't want my epitaph to only mention record profits and strategic acquisitions." Luke remained silent, sensing that something important was happening in that room, a subtle but significant shift. "Your proposal has merit," Edward finally admitted, "but I have conditions." "What are they?" Luke asked cautiously. "First, gradual implementation. We can't revolutionize our global practices overnight without catastrophic consequences. Second, an independent, external audit. I don't just trust our internal systems to validate changes. Third," he paused dramatically, "you need to complete your formal education. Without a top-tier MBA, you won't have the credibility to lead a division of this size." "That would take years," Luke protested. "Precisely," Edward confirmed. "Time for you to mature your vision and for us to implement sustainable changes, not just symbolic gestures. In the meantime, you can work with Caroline, developing pilot projects on a controlled scale." Luke considered the proposal. It wasn't the immediate revolution he had imagined, but it represented a genuine commitment to structural change, something he hadn't expected to achieve so easily. "And Rafael Torres?" he questioned. "He will be gradually reassigned. No public humiliations, no scandals. A dignified professional transition for someone who, despite everything, served the company faithfully for decades." The young man nodded, understanding the need for pragmatism, even in ethical revolutions. "Do we have a deal, then?" Edward asked, extending his hand. "We do," Luke confirmed, accepting the handshake. "But I need one more guarantee." "And what would that be?" "Total transparency. I want access to all relevant data, without exception, and the authority to implement emergency changes when we identify critical violations." Edward smiled, a renewed sparkle in his eyes. "You negotiate like a veteran, Luke Oliver. Done." As the sun began to set over New York, casting orange hues through the panoramic window, the two men, separated by generations and experiences, united by an unlikely history, finalized the outlines of a new era for VanceTech. Before saying goodbye, Edward made one last comment that would stay with Luke for a long time. "Know that even when I disagree with you, I am proud of the man you've become. Perhaps even more so for disagreeing. It means you think for yourself, not just repeating what I taught you. That is worth more than any blind obedience." On the way home, watching the city light up at dusk, Luke reflected on how that difficult confrontation had, paradoxically, strengthened his connection with Edward. Not as an untouchable idol, but as a complex human being capable of both greatness and flaws. Most importantly, the seed of change had been planted. Now, he would need to cultivate it with determination, patience, and wisdom. The New York autumn painted the trees along Fifth Avenue in shades of gold and orange. Luke, now 27, adjusted his tie knot as he gazed out the window of his office on the 30th floor of VanceTech's new headquarters. 7 years had passed since his confrontation with Edward, and the world, both his own and the corporate one, had profoundly transformed in that time. The Ethical Innovation Division, initially a risky experiment within the tech giant, had become a national and international benchmark for responsible business practices. Under his leadership, after completing an MBA at New York University, the division had revolutionized the company's supply chain, implemented strict environmental policies, and developed fiscal strategies that balanced competitiveness with social responsibility. The path had not been easy. In the early years, he faced fierce resistance from traditional executives, veiled sabotage, and attempts to cut his budget. Rafael Torres, in particular, had become a persistent adversary, using his influence to discredit initiatives he deemed impractical idealism. His relationship with Edward had also had its ups and downs, with heated disagreements over the pace of change and acceptable compromises. However, the results gradually silenced the critics. Improved working conditions in outsourced factories, reduced turnover and increased quality, sustainable environmental practices attracted conscious consumers and ESG investors. Fiscal transparency enhanced the company's reputation and opened previously resistant markets. VanceTech had not only survived the ethical revolution, but had thrived, becoming a case study in global business schools. A knock on the door interrupted his reflections. Renata Alves, his assistant, entered with a folder of documents. "The final contracts for the Institute have arrived, Luke. They need your signature before the ceremony." Luke smiled, sitting down at his desk to review the documents. The Vance Oliver Institute represented the culmination of a dream that had begun years earlier during a visit to the streets where he had sold brownie bites. That day, upon seeing children and teenagers facing the same hardships he had overcome, he felt compelled to create something more meaningful than traditional corporate programs. The idea was born as a pilot project, an educational center in the Lower East Side, offering programming and entrepreneurship classes to vulnerable youth. The success was immediate, not just for the technical skills developed, but for the environment of belonging and possibility it created. When he presented the proposal to expand the project into an autonomous foundation, Edward not only approved but insisted it bear both their surnames, Vance Oliver. A partnership that began with a boy overhearing a conspiracy must be recognized in history he had justified. Today, after months of planning, the Institute would be officially inaugurated in a large complex in the Bronx, near where Luke had grown up. With the capacity to serve 500 young people annually, it would offer advanced technological training, professional mentorship, and a social startup incubator. "Nervous about the speech?" Renata asked as he signed the documents. "A little," Luke admitted. "It's different from corporate presentations, more personal." "You'll do great," she assured him. No one could tell this story better. After finalizing the last details, Luke headed to the parking garage where a driver was waiting for him. Although he could afford luxury cars, he maintained relatively modest habits, preferring to invest in social projects and the comfort of Mrs. Irina, who, at 84, remained lucid and active, though with limited mobility. During the drive, he checked messages on his phone. Among them, one from Caroline Martin, now the global president of VanceTech after Edward's retirement 3 years prior. "We are proud of what you've built, Luke. The entire board will be there today." The message that truly moved him, however, came from Edward himself. "Ready for another revolutionary step, my young friend? I'll be in the front row to witness what began with an act of courage on the streets of New York. Your journey reminds me daily that no one is too small to make a difference. Upon arriving at the Institute's complex, Luke was greeted by organized chaos. Journalists, officials, executives, and most importantly, the first selected students and their families awaited the start of the ceremony. In the center of the main courtyard, a futuristic structure housed technology labs, classrooms, social spaces, and a social innovation hub. Behind the scenes, Luke found Edward, now 59. The multiple sclerosis had progressed significantly, confining him permanently to a wheelchair and partially limiting the movement of his arms. However, his mind remained as sharp as ever, and his gaze held its characteristic intensity. "The big day is here," the entrepreneur commented, a genuine smile lighting up his face, prematurely aged by his condition. "How do you feel?" "Grateful," Luke replied simply, shaking his mentor's hand. "For everything." The tensions that had occasionally marked their relationship over the years had given way to a deep mutual respect. Edward had recognized that Luke was not just his protégé, but a leader with his own vision and unwavering values. Luke, in turn, had understood that Edward's contradictions did not diminish his greatness, but only revealed his humanity. "Has Mrs. Irina arrived?" Edward asked. "She just got here. The staff is helping her with the wheelchair. She insisted on wearing her best dress even with the heat." "Typical of her," Edward smiled. "Some things never change." The ceremony began on time. After brief words from the officials present, Luke was called to the stage. Standing before the microphone, he surveyed the diverse audience. Executives in formal attire, simple families from the outer boroughs, attentive journalists, and, in the front, row Edward and Mrs. Irina side by side, both in wheelchairs, both with undisguised looks of pride. 12 years ago, I was on the streets of New York selling brownie bites, he began, his firm voice echoing through the space. Invisible to most of the people who hurried past. A boy that society had decided not to see. He paused, letting the image contrast with the confident man now before them. On one rainy night, that same invisible boy heard something no one else did. A conspiracy in a foreign language that threatened one of the country's largest companies. That moment changed my life, but not just because it gave me opportunities I never dreamed of having. His gaze met Edward's, who nodded slightly. It changed because it taught me something I carry with me to this day. That listening is a way of seeing beyond appearances. That the truth deserves to be defended, even when it costs something. And that everyone, regardless of where they come from, has something valuable to offer the world. He gestured to the complex around them. The Vance Oliver Institute is born from this principle. It is not just an educational center. It is an invitation to see potential where others see only problems. To listen to voices that are usually silenced. To believe that the next great innovator might be selling candy at a traffic light or delivering for an app on a bicycle today. Over 20 minutes, Luke detailed the philosophy and programs of the Institute, emphasizing how technology and education could be tools for social transformation when accessible to all. He concluded by returning to the personal story that had inspired the project. That boy with the brownie bites is in every young person who will walk through these doors. The only difference is that he was lucky enough to be heard at a crucial moment. This institute exists to systematically create that same luck for hundreds of young people every year. The speech was met with warm applause. The ceremony continued with the traditional ribbon cutting, performed symbolically by 3 people, Luke, Edward, and a 15-year-old girl, the top-ranked applicant, who lived in a community in the South Bronx. Hours later, when most of the guests had departed, Luke found himself in the Institute's Innovation Lab, where dozens of new computers awaited the first students who would begin classes the following week. Edward entered, skillfully maneuvering his motorized wheelchair. "It's impressive what you've built here," he commented, observing the space. "Far beyond what I imagined when we first discussed the concept." "I had good teachers," Luke replied, sitting in one of the chairs to be at his mentor's eye level. "And I've learned as much from the mistakes as from the successes." Edward smiled, contemplative. "Do you know what I'm most proud of in your journey, Luke? It's not the professional success, not even this institute. It's that you never lost your essence, the boy who had the courage to approach. That powerful businessman with an unbelievable story is still there, only now with the tools to make even bigger changes. He paused, adjusting himself in the chair before continuing. The board is considering my suggestion for you to take over as president of Vanstech in the coming years. Luke's eyes widened in surprise. I thought Caroline was going to stay in the role for a long time. She's planning her transition. She wants to focus on international expansion and needs someone she trusts to lead the operations in the US, someone with a vision for the future and solid principles. The offer was both tempting and daunting. Leading the company that had changed his life would represent the closing of an extraordinary circle, from the invisible boy to the CEO. However, Luke knew the path would still present many challenges. I need to think about it, he answered honestly. I have commitments to the Institute, to the projects in the ethics division. And that's exactly why you're the ideal candidate, Edward interrupted. The Vanstech of the future needs someone who sees beyond the next fiscal quarter, someone who understands that technology, without a humanitarian purpose, is just empty code. Before Luke could respond, Mrs. Irina appeared at the door accompanied by a nurse. There you are, the old woman commented, her English still heavily accented after all these years, always in meetings, even on a party day. Luke smiled at his mentor and grandmother at heart. We were just contemplating how it all began and where it might lead, he explained. It began with attentive ears, Mrs. Irina reminded them with her characteristic wisdom, and it will go where the heart leads. Edward nodded respectfully. Wise words, Mrs. Irina, as always. The three of them stood in silence for a few moments, united by an improbable story that had intertwined their destinies. Through the large windows, the New York sunset cast golden light over the Bronx, no longer a place to be left behind, but the setting for a quiet revolution that was beginning in that very space. The following week, when the first students arrived at the Institute, Luke made sure to be there to welcome them personally. Among them, he noticed a slim boy with sharp eyes and simple clothes who was observing everything with restrained admiration. Something about him reminded Luke of himself years ago. "What's your name?" he asked, approaching him. "Matthew, sir," the young man replied, visibly nervous. "Welcome to the Institute, Matthew. What are you most hoping to learn here?" The boy hesitated for just a second before answering with determination. "I want to learn how to create something that nobody believes is possible coming from someone like me." Luke smiled, recognizing in those words the echo of his own dreams. "Then you've come to the right place," he assured him, placing a hand on the teenager's shoulder. "Because the greatest lesson I've learned on my journey is that there are no small or big dreams. There are only dreams waiting for the opportunity to be realized." As he walked among the young students that morning, Luke reflected on how it all began with a simple act of listening, something Edward had once called seeing with your ears. That seemingly insignificant moment on the rainy streets of New York had triggered a sequence of events that had not only transformed his life, but was now expanding to influence hundreds of other trajectories. The invisible boy who sold brownie bites had become a man whose vision was impacting the future of a nation. And each new student who passed through the gates of the Institute represented the continuation of that legacy, a promise that no one would ever have to be invisible to have value in the American society they were helping to build, one brownie bite at a time. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the journey of Luke and Edward has touched your hearts and shown how small acts of courage can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. For more inspiring stories like this, we have a special American Transformations playlist that you can access by clicking right here. If this narrative resonated with you, be sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and hit that like button so we can continue sharing these stories of resilience and hope. And tell us in the comments, which moment in Luke's story touched you the most? We look forward to reading your thoughts and continuing this conversation. Until the next story.